Well, that was refreshing, singing again for the first time. Thank you to our choir and to our music director. It's just so exciting to be able to do that again. Good morning to all of you, and welcome to Rosedale United Church. My name is Kristin, and along with my colleague, our music director, Susan Suchard, we are so glad that you are here. It's good to be together. It feels good to see everyone's face this morning and to mimic the sunshine outside with the faces, your bright eyes in here. I'm glad that you're here. Rosedale United is a hub in this community that supports human flourishing. And every week that means we set apart and protect this time for you to reconnect with the divine and also to your sense of self and to your sense of community. Your presence here is what creates community, and we hope that this is a healing and a nourishing space for you to be this morning. It's so thrilling this morning to be celebrating a baptism, our first baptism since we've been reopened, and what a joy it is to see little Holden crawling around. And that's okay, Lindsay. I'm using this as a way of saying we've got people of all ages here today, and we want you to feel comfortable in this space. So if you are a little person, I'm going to get you to turn around and look at the back, and you'll see Carolyn there. Just give a wave, Carolyn. Carolyn and our youth leaders have a program ready to go for kids. They're going to stay until we've baptized baby Holden so that they can join in the joy of that celebration. And then Carolyn and the youth leaders will take any kid who wants to go downstairs for some kid time. Otherwise, if you prefer to stay with your parents, we do have an area at the back that's got quiet coloring activities and things like that. But what a joy it is to hear the sound of children in our sanctuary. Awesome. Rosedale United is an affirming congregation. We celebrate people of all sexualities, orientations, and gender identities as created in God's image. And we're grateful today to be worshiping on this land that is the traditional home of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. We also have another special guest joining us today for our reflection time, and that is Professor Alice McLaughlin from York University. I heard Alice, I think it maybe was a couple years ago now, on Tapestry, on the CBC radio program Tapestry. It was just at the beginning of the pandemic. And I knew I wanted to invite Alice to speak in our sanctuary because the themes that she studies as a philosopher are just so right on with what we're about as supporting human flourishing. I'll give a fuller welcome to Alice later on, but we're sure glad you're with us this morning, Alice. Thank you. And so now we move more deeply into this time of worship. I want to invite you into a time of quiet and just noticing the sounds that are around us. And we'll follow that by a time of opening prayer. Let us pray. Loving God, creator and keeper of all life, we praise you this day. In each opening bud, in each blossoming tree, you invite us to experience your presence and to find ourselves as part of all life. You, our Maker, nourish us with beauty and ancient words of wisdom. We are born from you, and in you we live and move and grow as your community of faith. Deepen our appreciation for your wonder and mystery, rooted in our veins as lifeblood, as spirit song, as the ground of our being. As a child is formed in their mother's womb, we are formed in you, each one of us being made into your body, your church, your blessing for the world. For this we give you thanks today and every day. Amen. I want to invite Jim Pitblado, who is helping lead our prayers of the community this morning. Every week we ask a different member of our community to help us in composing these prayers, and they truly are the prayers of what's on our hearts and our minds. Let us pray. Giving and loving God, we have gathered in your presence today, hoping in some way to hear and to know you, and to feel within ourselves and our world your new and everlasting life. Gather up our lingering fears and confusion. Meet our anxieties with compassion and understanding. Open our eyes to your love and grace surrounding us. Open our ears to hear you calling us to new possibilities. Open our imaginations to new possibilities.
Help us to experience you standing in our midst. Teach us to love as you love. You give us a new commandment to love one another Yet our world grows more divided daily, not just between left and right, but within the left and the right, and in our country, our communities, and families. We lament the aggression that has moved in and made itself at home in our politics and in our civic life together. We lament the lack of kindness, the lack of tolerance, and people's unwillingness to listen to another point of view. Where, O God, is a turning point for our hearts? Who will lead us in a civil way of life, in respect, in tolerance, and humility?
May our broken world and our broken lives be transformed in your image. Teach us how to love as you loved. We offer our woundedness and turn to you for healing and newness of life.
For you, O God, our strength, our hope, and our salvation. Amen.
Amen.
A reading from John chapter 13, verses 31 to 35. When he had gone out, Jesus said, now the Son of Man has been glorified, and God has been glorified in him. If God has been glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him at once. Little children, I am with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and as I said to the Jews, so I say now to you. Where I am going, you cannot come. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. This is the witness of the early church. Herein lies wisdom.
Thank you, Bill. Well, I'm so pleased to welcome to our reflection time this morning Alice McLaughlin, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy in the Department of Philosophy at York University, where she writes and teaches in moral, political, and feminist and LGBTQ+ philosophy. Professor McLaughlin's research focuses on philosophical issues arising in the aftermath of conflict, and her current research explores the ethics and politics of civility or incivility in situations of disagreement. So lots of resonance with her research and where our culture is at right now, and this is why we've asked Dr. McLaughlin to open up for us a conversation. And it will truly be a conversation. Dr. McLaughlin will share some thoughts, and then I'll follow up with some questions for her to expand on, and then the floor will be open if you have a question for Dr. McLaughlin that arises for you as she's speaking. You're welcome to ask it. So we welcome Alice McLaughlin.
First of all, I just want to thank all of you for welcoming my family and me into your community this morning. It's really lovely to be here. So, as Kristin mentioned, 2 years ago, I was asked to talk as a moral philosopher on the CBC radio program Tapestry. So 2 years ago, I didn't feel like a moral philosopher at all. My wife and I were pretty much sealed in our home with our two very energetic small children. And most of my brain space was devoted to questions like, is there even music other than the Moana soundtrack? Could we build another obstacle course in the basement? What else in the kitchen can I use as a science experiment? Is there really such a thing as too much screen time? And this was just a kind of repeating melody over a low, thrumming bass line of anxiety. Do I risk going to the grocery store? If I don't, am I putting the delivery person at risk? They say playgrounds are closed, but can my kids go to the park? They need to go to the park. Can we get the furnace fixed before it gets cold? What if we have to let someone in our house? I wonder how my mom's doing in Nova Scotia, or when I'll see her again. What if things get worse? When does this end? And what am I supposed to be doing right now? I'm not an essential worker or a frontline service person. I'm nothing terribly useful. So where do I fit in? And thoughts like this in some ways feel like they were a lifetime ago, maybe even another world or reality. I feel like pandemic new normals have replaced each other so suddenly and abruptly that it's really hard to weave them back together into a story. Everything was shut down, there were rainbows everywhere, we were all in this together, and then patios opened up but not schools, and then everything shut down again, and then there were vaccines, but it was slow, and then there was wave after wave after wave, and as they crested, they didn't keep bringing us together. The waves knocked us further and further apart. And so now we're told we're in an endemic phase. But that phase is shaped as much by economic anxiety, polarization, racist violence, and war as it is by COVID. And at the same time, COVID still seems to enter into and weave through and be part of each of these threats. So in some ways, my life and maybe yours doesn't feel that much easier or clearer or more comprehensible than those early days of homemade bread and homeschool. So that's all to say, I think the question of how to live in a pandemic, how to live well, which is really a question how to live well in a situation of discombobulation, disorientation, uncertainty, and moral complexity, is as relevant today as it was in 2020. And so I'm going to share a few of my thoughts with you, and maybe you'll have some questions. One of my favorite philosophers, Hannah Arendt, wrote about ethics and thinking during another time of tremendous uncertainty and upheaval. She was a Jewish thinker fleeing Germany in the Second World War and trying to understand as a refugee how her homeland and her colleagues and people she knew and liked and respected could have gone so wrong. And what she noticed was, it wasn't that they didn't have moral rules, but at times of tremendous disorientation, instead of moral rules grounding us and making sense, these were usually the first things to go. Either they lost their meaning, or the meanings got switched around and tangled up in ideology and groupthink so that they meant different things to different people. Instead of grounding our thinking, they gave us something to lean on so we didn't have to think. And that's where things started to go wrong. Because when everything is in upheaval, when everything is uncertain, that's when we need to think well. And this has always made sense to me, because a rule is only as good as your understanding of how to apply it and when to apply it. And this can be anything from I before E except after C, but then there's all the exceptions, to my personal favorite, righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, when it's clockwise or counterclockwise, because you're kind of going both ways. And so before we have useful, moral, or even religious rules, we need to become people who can use them well. And so this is why, in times of uncertainty, I find it helpful to turn to the language of virtues and thinking about the virtues. So what do I mean by them? I mean the kind of deeply ingrained practices and habits of thinking about the world and responding to the world in particular ways. The things that make up our character traits, the ways we regulate our bodies and emotions and thoughts and relationships. Words like kindness, courage, integrity, honesty, generosity, and justice. And this is how I like to think about ethics. I like it because it starts where we are. Each of us is a person with thoughts and feelings and bodies and relationships. And those four things are a lot. That is a lot to manage, thoughts and feelings and a body and relationships. And yet, one of the main job we have as humans is to figure out how to do this well, how to do it well at the same time. And we only do this by failing and learning from one another. We do it by practicing, by looking at the people we admire, our examples, our role models, seeing how they do it, and by building a community of teachers, role models, and peers who can show us how to get that little bit better by example, by teaching, or in friendship. I also like it because virtue terms are what philosophers call thick. And what they mean by that is when we think them, we all have a picture of it. It's sometimes hard to know how to describe right and wrong, but we all have a picture of what a kind person is and what they do, what a brave person is and what they do, what a just person is and what we do. And so even when we don't know exactly what the right answer is in any given situation, it's easier to think, how would a kind person respond right now? And even if you don't know exactly what they do, some things they wouldn't do. They wouldn't be mean. They wouldn't be exclusionary. They wouldn't turn away from someone who needs our help. And, the other thing that's wonderful is we have libraries everywhere of examples. In fact, at my own church, I'm a Sunday school teacher, and I often use virtue examples as a way of explaining the lessons. Kids know what it is to be brave like Esther, to be loving like Ruth and Naomi, to forgive like Joseph, to be kind like Jesus. And there is room for individuality in the virtues. Not all kind people are the same. Some bring gifts to neighbors, some make music, some look for the person who's left out at a party, some organize NGOs to redistribute wealth. We know that brave people are different. Some take on extraordinary physical feats like mountain climbing. Others protest or speak out against injustice. Others are brave by committing to who they are in a transphobic world. So thinking about the virtues instead of particular rules gives us room to be ourselves, to embody them in our own particular way, and to use our own particular building blocks, the kinds of thoughts we have, the kinds of feelings that we ourselves have. And virtues acknowledge something that I know very well, which is that there's lots of different ways to mess up. One of my favorite philosophers, Aristotle, talks about hitting a target, and virtue means getting it right at the middle of the target. And there's lots of ways to go wrong. And that can be helpful for those of us who tend to overdo it. More is not always better. That way leads self-righteousness, narrow-mindedness, hypocrisy. So when I was asked to think about the pandemic and post-pandemic ethics, it felt natural for me to think, what virtues do we need now? What do we need to be cultivating in ourselves and in one another? And I came up with 5, but you might have more. And I haven't quite come up with the right terms for them. But the first one is something like attention, curiosity, moral imagination, the willingness to really look and see, and to recognize what are the deepest harms, who has been hurt the most, what's needed right now, whether that's individual or collective. And I think that naturally leads to the second one, which is compassion and generosity. We need new kinds of care and giving, whether it's mutual aid, organized support for countries at war, looking to those who are left vulnerable in our own communities. But at the same time, compassion and generosity needs to be balanced with courage, even resistance. Not just following the letter of the law or the minimum we can do, but going deeper, asking, is this just? Is this right? Do we need more? Do we need something different? And then one that I think has really come to the fore is sacrifice and compromise. The pandemic asked people like me, who are almost never expected to sacrifice something, to give up just convenience and just freedom. And we rebelled, and we couldn't handle it. And I think that it has awoken a sense that maybe just the feeling of being complacent tells us that sacrifices is needed. Now when I feel like everything is easy, I take that almost as a sign. Am I giving myself to sacrifice? Am I compromising as much as I need to? But, these 4 are hard, all of them. And so the last one I think is more and more necessary is grace. Something like forgiveness, but wider maybe. We have to fight against a culture of shaming and judgment, to keep social ties when all of us fail to exhibit the other virtues or make different moral choices, in order to keep our shared public space, our shared commitments, our life and our world together. We have to learn to respond to other people's fears, even when they interfere with our own. I've thought a lot about this in response to anti-mask and anti-vaccine protests, which I find hard because I have small children. I have a child under 5, and things are still scary for so many people. What does it mean to respond to something that you find wrong with both courage and grace? How do we mobilize curiosity and compassion for those we believe to be deeply wrong without letting down those for whom we are responsible and those we think are being hurt? Virtues never, ever give us the answer. That's not how they work. They function like heuristics, maybe like lighthouses. So we have to find our own way through the ocean, and it's foggy. And all that the virtues can do, asking, what would someone with courage do right now? What's the kind thing to do? Is keep us off the rocks, shine out light and noise into the fog to warn us that this way lies real treachery, and it's still up to us to guide our way through a dark and foggy night, with those keeping us somewhere on the straight and narrow. We still have to find our own path. So 2 years ago, I was optimistic that we would emerge from the pandemic with a new hierarchy of moral obligations. I announced this on the radio, and listening to it feels discouraging. I thought we were going to be forced to confront how central vulnerability and interdependence are to our collective life together. But I don't want to be a total downer about this. I don't want to be too hard on 2020, Alice. I think we've had glimpses of it. We've seen it in Ukraine and in response to Ukraine. We've seen it in protests against racist violence and new movements and changes made by demands from the bottom to the top. We've seen it in, I see it all the time in young people. I just think that people who are in their teens and 20s now are possibly the most amazing generation ever to come up, and their willingness to speak loudly and be vulnerable and honest about their needs and their care for one another inspires me, sometimes beyond words. So I think I'm optimistic about what is brewing and bubbling beneath the surface of our supposed return to normal. I think in 2022, we're all exhausted, morally, as well as physically and emotionally. But maybe this exhaustion is productive. Maybe it's not just a respite, but more like a field lying fallow, being left for a while to become more fertile, or an immune response kicking in, building up new antibodies. I think that our initial response to disruption and discombobulation, once the adrenaline leaves us, once the fight or flight stops, is to just sort of sit back. But I think if we let ourselves listen and attend and ask questions about virtue and complexity in those moments, that there can be the growth of new virtues I can't even imagine, and new questions and answers and questions beyond those. So I think 2022, Alice, can take a little of 2020's optimism, and I hope you can as well. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Alice. To a brief time of response. I just, as you were talking, I had one question form, and I apologize because I gave Alice my questions in advance, and this wasn't one of them. So I'm springing this on you, but what I'm wondering when it comes to virtue is how do we keep the momentum to lean into kindness and lean into that grace and forgiveness, whichever virtue you're calling on in the moment, when it feels like, let's say, a person or the other side or what have you isn't meeting you halfway. How do you keep going when it feels like you're just met with a wall?
Well, first of all, that's really hard. Yeah, I'm not going to pretend I know the answer. I mean, I think the answer is always don't do it alone. I think one of the things that I love about virtue traditions, so Aristotelian, Confucian, Christian, they all focus first on community, and that's where everything starts. And so I think the only way, when you face a wall, the only place left to look is to your sides. And I think you make sure that you have the right people around you, that you have people who are asking the same questions and who aren't afraid to ask them of you as well.
Thanks, Alice. That feels good. That's a good response. I like that. And another question I had was how do we bring this conversation of virtues into the community around us without sounding like holier than thou, Because virtue is one of those words that, all the words that you mentioned today are universal, right? Like courage is universal, kindness is universal, but virtue has this sort of baggage. It's kind of baggage. How do we not sound like do-gooders?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I'm not. May I? Is that?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
And I just gave a talk where I definitely sounded like a do-gooder, but my children are in the audience, so they can give you a very different picture. We talk about virtue signaling. Just the idea of making a moral claim, saying something is right or wrong, is seen as putting yourself forward as better than others. And I can see that makes it hard to talk about the virtues. Use other words, talk about character traits, or talk about, it's interesting because we're afraid of talking about moral virtues, but we are very much a virtue-oriented culture. We just talk about physical virtues and economic virtues. Being your best self, maximizing your potential, all the talk around New Year's resolutions. It's just that we've let the moral and spiritual substance fall out of what that best self is. So I think that language gives us lots of ways to meet people where they are and where we are. And if the word virtue isn't doing it for you, talk about moral habits and practices. And also pay attention. Self-righteousness and hypocrisy are awful and dangerous, but they don't hang on to language, they hang on to people. And so, starting from knowledge of your own imperfection and talking about how to cultivate practices from within that. And there are sometimes other faith traditions can be very helpful here. So sort of Buddhist faith traditions, bringing as many languages as you need to be able to connect and answer the questions, I think is good.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, so we'll open to the congregation. We have time for maybe two questions tops, but does anyone have a question or comment that they want to make? Okay. Rose, if you want to stand up, and I'll pair it back to Alice so she can hear. Yeah.
Well, I think part of the answer came in your shade over the word virtue. You kept so much reference to things like virtue signaling in the news, particularly. But I'm wondering what your view would be of the changing meaning of words today. Truth it can be distorted. We have alternative facts that sometimes consider the impact of postmodernism on our current beliefs. How do you navigate that sort of thing?
That's a wonderful question. I'm not going to impose on you the kind of answer it really deserves, because that would take a long time. We spent the 20th century noticing that the story of the world wasn't as simple as it seemed, and that part of why it seemed simple is it was only one set of people's story, and that truth is more complicated than that and more contested, and that the more we let in different perspectives, the more the one story we were all told gets complicated and changed. And I think that was a good thing. I think it was important, but it brings new risks with it, because if you're saying things are messy and they depend on your perspective, that makes you vulnerable to people who want to manipulate that perspective, who want to use it, who say, well, if it depends on your perspective, I can make you believe a perspective that makes me stronger or richer or have more airtime. And so I think the task that's being asked of us, which is not an easy one, is to sit with the idea that truth is messy and complicated and not simple, and still be on our guard for fake truths, for lies. I think we can say the truth is complicated, but that's still a lie. That's still false. That didn't happen. And the task of discernment for all of us is to do the work not just of critical and creative thinking, but also, again, building a community of knowers and seekers who can double check our perspective, who can call us when we've fallen for something that's obviously wrong. We can't, and this is why I started with curiosity as a virtue and attention, because I think we have to pay a lot of attention now. It's almost unfair, more than we should have to. It shouldn't be this hard to know what news is real. But that's where we've landed, not entirely for bad reasons, but partly. And so that's what is being asked of us.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you. I'm going to invite everyone to stand. We're going to sing Love Divine. finish then thy new creation. I love that line in the hymn we just sang. And I'm grateful to Alice for reminding us that when it comes to living out virtues, that's what's happening when we gather together as community in this place. We're being nourished and nurtured by God's divine spirit, being made new so that we can go out and try again, to be more loving, to be more kind, to be more courageous, to be more justice-oriented. And so we go.